Good afternoon, everyone. There is a tremendous storm going on outside my office. So I was just saying to Jamie, the thunder, I can't control the sound. If the power goes out, Patrick will continue and I'll come back in on my phone. I mean, Zoom does have its hazards, but I'm delighted that today we are welcoming Jamie Brenner and her wonderful novel, Blush. And to that end, a toast to you.
Thank you.
Ooh.
That is some nicely colored wine there, Barbara.
Well, it really is, but I am going to take advantage of doing this program with you to give a little plug for my personal favorite rosé. It's called Delheim, and it's a Pinotage rosé from South Africa in the Frenchos district. And my husband and I found it while we were touring South Africa, and we had it at a wine tasting at Delheim, and we just loved it. And my husband, displaying some ingenuity, found an American importer because, Jamie, if you really look into the wine trade, you will know that it's not always possible to find a great wine somewhere else in the world and then buy it in America, because it's a very tightly controlled trade.
Yes. So that was a real coup that he was able to make that happen, because to fall in love with a great wine, and then you finally found it, like a great love passing on a train that pulls away from the platform, and then to never have it again. So that's great. And it's beautiful. That color is gorgeous.
Well, it actually is. It's apricot, which is one of the shades that you now find rosé. And it says Delheim, well worth the journey, which I think is a very nice little, label addition, family wines in South Africa. But, Jamie, I can remember when a rosé was something sort of like pink lemonade from California, and it was for amateur drinkers. It was like when you were in high school and you wanted to learn to drink, you drank a daiquiri or something, bourbon and Coke, because most people don't really like the taste of alcohol when they're young. And
right.
Do you remember what vineyard it was? It was almost like a standard rosé.
It was an accident when they made the discovery, and I forget the vineyard. It wasn't Mondavi. It was a California winemaker who accidentally was bleeding off the grape juice and discovered that he would come up with the lighter, the pink version of it. And the title Blush is from that original rosé, which was called Blush and was much sweeter than what we enjoy today as our popular rosé. But yes, it was almost a fad. It got popular very quickly and then just as quickly fell out of favor. I use the term because I feel like the books I write about were sort of in the same on the same curve of getting very popular and then not being taken seriously, although they gave such enjoyment.
Well, I think you're right. You make a statement that, books wine is like fashion, they're trends and things that become popular, or, some celebrity hypes something and everybody rushes for it and it goes away. What I have found with rosés over the years, and Patrick, a research question for you, because he can tell me in the chat. See if you can find the early California. I'm sure if you Google it, you can tell me what it is. Is that they've become drier, and now there's some wonderful French vineyards that are making rosés, and they come in all different colors. I pointed out that this Delheim. Look at the difference, how apricot-y this one is, and then look at how really robust this one is. And it's become okay, rather than a sign that you're an amateur drinker if you order a rosé out at dinner. And rosés go really well with a wide variety of different foods. I'm not of the school that says you can't drink a red wine with fish if you feel like it, but a rosé is a really nice bridge sometimes between people who don't want a white wine or a red wine, and maybe it's poultry or it's fish or a salmon.
Absolutely.
Your bag.
What am I looking up again?
You are looking up the California vineyard that popularized rosé back in, I'd say, the 1960s, maybe,
70s.
No, earlier than that. It was really, as Jamie says, kind of a cliche.
Sutter Home?
No.
All right.
No, that's not it.
That might have been the guy who, is he the one who discovered it?
Yeah, that's what I was
Oh,
just looking that up.
okay.
Yeah.
George West of El Pinal Winery in Lodi, California, made what is documented as the first white Zinfandel in 1869. And
Wow.
then in the 70s, Bob Trinchero of Sutter Home Winery created white Zinfandel, blah, blah, blah. I'll keep researching, sorry.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, this is esoteric. I was just pointing out that rosé used to be, as I say, it was sort of a thing for amateur drinkers, and now it's become very sophisticated and in a very large variety. But the great thing about your title, Jamie, is that blush not only refers to the wine, but you have a sexy book club in here, which some of those books might indeed make people blush on reading them. So this is a brilliant title. Is it yours? Did you come up with it? Because often authors don't.
I did. Thank you very much. Some titles, you have to work and struggle and you never find one that you feel 100% about. But from the very beginning, from the very inception of the idea, that title, I had that title. And sometimes having a cohesive, strong title like that almost can keep you on track, throughout the novel. And I really like knowing the title before I even begin to write.
Well, that's an advantage, although experience has shown me over the years in talking to authors that very often, even if you like the title, the sales department has a different view.
Oh, yeah.
You don't get to keep it. Now, you have written various other books. According to the most recent update, 5 earlier novels, including The Forever Summer and The Wedding Sisters. But what I really love in this little online bio for you, and it's so apropos to what I was just mentioning, you grew up in suburban Philadelphia on a steady diet of Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz novels, and later moved to New York City to live like the heroines in those books, which I think is, just a wonderful ambition. Is it true?
It's absolutely true. And the reason why these books have stayed with me my whole life is I read them at an early age, probably too early. And it was the first messaging I got that you can really go out there and try and do whatever you want to do. I'm someone who grew up in Philadelphia and didn't get to New York until I was in my 20s. And so geographically, I'm less than 2 hours away, but my parents would never dream of taking me and saying, here's this big city where you could work in magazines or books, whatever you want to do. But Scruples said that to me, Chances said that to me. And so that was very much part of my sort of creative and naively hopeful DNA as a young person starting out in the world.
One of the fun things about those authors, we didn't have Jackie Collins at the store, but we had her sister. And I remember seeing pictures of Judith Krantz and so forth, as they were so glamorous. It's like Barbara Bradford Taylor, who doesn't really write that sort of book. She's more into saga, but her persona, is terribly glamorous with, fabulous clothes and important jewels and, the right makeup. And so you felt like, particularly Judith Krantz, I think you felt like, she was leading the life she was writing about, although, I didn't know her. So for all I know, she was a mouse who sat back in a room in her sweatpants and wrote her books.
I honestly, I believe when I see Judith Krantz that I could see her in bed in cashmere pajamas. I did just watch the documentary about Jackie Collins called Lady Boss. And it showed that Jackie Collins, the author, was very much her suit of armor in presenting herself to the world, and that a very different woman was behind that image. And, as you know, back in that day, we didn't have the constant bombardment of social media to give us all these little glimpses into people's lives. So if an author wanted to present that type of glossy veneer, it was very easy to keep that up as the sole way that we knew them.
Well, I think it was partly marketing. I realized that I think I just screwed up. Jackie is the author. Her sister was the actress.
That's right. Joan,
well,
yeah.
Okay, so Jackie is the one who came to the store, and we have a wonderful photograph in the store of her sitting and me standing behind her, sort of trying to hide my less well-clad self. behind her very elegant shoulders and the whole thing. And she was lovely. She was really a joy to host and to get to know. And we've had Barbara Taylor Bradford at the store, which again, is a somewhat similar persona. I often think about Barbara Cartland, especially now at my age, when she made a comment that I've always really loved, which is basically, as we age, she says, we have to make a decision. We can either, cultivate the body or we can cultivate the face. She said, have selected the face. Because she got very large, and she was always kind of draped up in fancy things and so forth. But she did keep a very youthful face well into her older decades. And I just love that comment. She said, selected the face, which I thought, hey.
Sounds like a good way to go to me.
Well, it does. I often think the same, since I'm the same age now that she was when she said that. So, I try to keep it in mind. Anyway, tell me about selecting a vineyard. I mean, I realize this is a story about 3 generations of women and the differences that in the way that their families and society perceives and treats them, and the way they give themselves permission or not to do things. But you could have said it in a number of worlds, and you chose a vineyard. So why a vineyard? What attracted you about a vineyard for this?
I was in Sag Harbor, which is a waterfront town on the North Fork of Long Island, or near the North Fork of Long Island, researching an earlier book called Drawing Home. And I was having dinner in a restaurant called Walfer Kitchen. And I noticed the wine list was all Walfer's own wines. And, I'm fascinated by families and family businesses and dynasties. So I did a little research and realized it was, in fact, a family-owned winery who also had restaurants. And they had this gorgeous rosé called Summer in a Bottle. And I just thought, like, that's a book. So that was the beginning, was just the thought of the family, the winery, summer, rosé. But I had been wanting to write this sort of ode to the women writers of the 80s for a long time. It's the book I've kind of always wanted to write, and I just didn't know how to put all the pieces together. And I went to a wine tasting class in New York City at a place called Murray's Cheese, and the winemaker from a place called Bedell Cellars on the North Fork was there. And he said something about wine and cheese, which I found really interesting. He said there's this notion of terroir, which is the ground, but it also means sort of a certain place. So a wine can never be anything but the place that it's from. And I thought, neither really can a person. We can move, we can reinvent ourselves, we can be whoever we want, but we can never change our place of origin. So all of these things came together, and that's how I got the story of Blush, 3 generations of women set on a winery, grappling with each one at a turning point in their lives.
Well, I think a winery is an interesting choice. I mean, there's a wonderful mystery series by Ellen Crosby that is set in Virginia wineries. And over time, there have been, I think it was Peter Mayle, who, wrote books about Provence, but he also wrote, he also wrote some crime novels. I think it was Peter Mayle. And again, it was about wine, wine fraud, wine competition, wine in California versus wine in France. Martin Walker writes a wonderful series about Bruno, the chief of police, but wine is all threaded through it. I mean, because the French, they don't drink it at breakfast most of the time, but otherwise, you can't really. I was once in a French restaurant years and years ago. My husband and I were near Vaux-le-Vicomte, and we stayed at a hotel, and there was a restaurant named after Georges Sand, the writer. And this is at the end of 3 weeks in France, and we went out to dinner, and I said to him, I'm done with wine. I said, I'm not a big drinker. I said, I just can't drink any more wine. I'm gonna have dinner. I'll just have, sparkling water or something. The waiter actually cried. he was so upset, and he said, madam, he said, you cannot do justice to our food. You can't, I mean, it was like,
Wow.
couldn't even imagine that I was about to have dinner in his beautiful restaurant without ordering wine. So I caved.
Sure.
I mean, it was obviously really a big deal for him. But the thing about a winery is that it's a really parlous business. I mean, it is so
Absolutely.
vulnerable to, you're right about terroir, but the thing is, the terroir can even be vulnerable. You can have drought, you can have insects, you can have the horrible phylloxera epidemic,
Absolutely.
on and on. And so if you want to have a family facing potential ruin, then a winery is actually a very good choice, because it's very capital intensive, labor intensive, lots of investment, and it can all go, in a bad year.
Absolutely. One storm close to harvest and you're done. I mean, it's inherently dramatic. It's high risk, high reward, very hard work. Of course, it's physically beautiful, to look at, to experience, to describe in a novel. I mean, it's almost like, how could you not set a book in a winery at some point? It's just begging for it.
I love the fact that it's moving north. They're actually planting vineyards in Scotland.
Amazing.
I know.
Well,
I mean, climate change is really going to do a lot to the wine industry, because, the ice wines in Germany, can you make them? The great French vineyards, is the terroir going to be so changed by climate that,
mhm.
Northumberland will become the next version of, Bordeaux. I mean, it's fascinating. Anyway, enough about the vineyard. Tell us about the Holland family, because really the point of the book is these 3 generations of women and how you want to chronicle their lives as they have been and as they're coming together in this book.
Sure. So the family, the patriarch of the family, is from an Argentinian winemaking family whose father came to this country, first began working in New York City, couldn't give up winemaking, and moved out to California, which was the only place where wines were being made back in the day. So in the novel Blush, his son is really a pioneer, the first person to take a defunct potato farm in the North Fork of Long Island and start a winery. And this is based on a real couple, which was chronicled in a memoir called The Vineyard by Patricia Thomas Hargrave. She and her husband were the first to do this back in 1971. Mm-hmm. So what I learned in my early research is that the winemaking business is very, very male dominated, has always been for years, to the extent that there was a superstition that women couldn't even be around the wine in the barrels because they might be able to somehow turn it. So I went into this family thinking, the patriarch is king. He marries a woman who is from a high society family. She gives up everything to move out to the farm to be by his side. And while she's willing and able to work as his partner, she slowly finds herself kind of pushed to the side into more traditional female role of hostessing and building their dream house and caring for the children. So then we cut to their child, Leah, who's my protagonist. When the book starts, she's in her 50s, and she had dreamed of being a part of the business, but was told, in no uncertain terms, this is not for you, this is for your brother. You go off, little lady, and find something else to do. So as the book begins, she's in her 50s, she's had her own successful business, but when she finds that her parents are at risk of losing the vineyard, she can't give up thinking that I have something to contribute here. Meanwhile, her daughter, who's in college, Sadie, also joins them at the vineyard. She's in a little artistic intellectual crisis, struggling writing her thesis. She's a feminist. She's a very serious reader, Julia Kristeva and Susan Sontag. And she really comes there just to escape the pressure of her work. But when she arrives, she ends up, finding something far more compelling and challenging and distracting than she could have imagined, which is her grandmother's old trashy novel book club.
Yes, which is wonderful. I think that we should mention that it's not just the vineyard that they stand to lose, but their home. They have a wonderful historic home, and because lots of vineyards do, although some of them were purpose built in California. I mean, there's not really a Tuscan, castle in California that was there. And that was why there was a vineyard. So it's more than just losing the vineyard. It's
Yes.
really losing their family home and their family past that is at stake.
Yes,
And the brother really never cared that much about it, right?
that's right. The brother, not the most ambitious person, and was able to coast along life on his parents' wealth and status, never really had to work for anything. But because he was the male child, his father and Leah's father automatically viewed him as the heir apparent, justified or not. And that's something Leah had to live with her entire life.
Right. I think it would have been, it would be a different book if the brother really loved the vineyard and, wanted to run it and was therefore fencing out his sister, but it isn't really that way. The father, he said he's Argentinian, so he's bringing really basically an old world concept to what is an old world industry. Really.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we all bring with us, that goes back to terroir and place and how we're brought up. And, really fiction, and what I learned early on about fiction writing is true character is revealed through stress. So here we have this patriarch who would only listen to his own counsel, maybe his son, if he was really like stretching things and turning a blind eye to his laziness. And here we are in a summer of turmoil when the women in his family are offering him valuable input, and his pride and his preconceived notions of how a business should be run, how life should be run, will not let him hear them. And so that is, leading them all to potential ruin. And it all comes down to just his mindset being unable to change.
Well, how old is he by the time we are meeting him in this book? I keep looking for a light, sorry, because the light keeps doing weird things here in the storm.
He's in his 70s.
Okay, so I mean, it's not likely anybody's really going to reform him in his 70s. So it's going to be a question of doing an end one around him or getting him to retire or whatever it is has to happen. So you've got these three women. You've got the older woman, the 50ish daughter, and the younger one.
Yep.
And they are not interested in losing the family business or the family home. So, how are they going to come together? I love the cheese shop. You talk about terroir, but the truth is that cheese, while it can be manufactured in other places, cheese has a terrific history of terroir too. I mean, you only have to go to England and eat your way around. You can have Yard and Cornwall, and you can have, Lancashire cheese, and which doesn't even travel in Lancashire. Special cheese in Wales, I can't remember the name of, but anyway, cheese very much like, and I wonder, in California, Sonoma is, at least for a long time, was as well known for cheese as it was for wine. There was a lot of cheese making there. So they really kind of go together, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, getting back to the fact that cheese has its own terroir, in this wine and cheese pairing class that I took, one of the approaches to pairing is like goes with like. So if you have a North Fork wine, cheese from a dairy farm nearby would be what you would want to pair with it. And then of course, people go the opposite way in terms of complementary contrast, but that's absolutely a concept in cheese. And that was one of the things that when I was trying to conceive of the novel, I saw also just really fitting in nicely to the story I was trying to put together.
Well, I was thinking about, we have our own little rituals, but for example, Stilton, for a long time, and I think it's a great combination, Stilton is very good with port and walnuts. It's, kind of a way to end a meal because the cheese is so strong and the port, is a strong wine, and it's thick, it's sort of viscous wine, it's not light, and walnuts have crunch. And so, you wouldn't drink a light wine with a Roquefort, for example, because a Roquefort would just overpower it. And so there are lots of wine and cheese pairings that I find to be really wonderful. And so the middle daughter, the daughter, the 50th daughter, her business, in fact, has been a cheese shop, right, in Manhattan.
That's right. So she was turned away from the wine business, but she wanted to do something. And this was sort of a natural segue for her. She started working at a cheese shop just to have a job and fell in love with it and worked her way up, and then eventually had her own shop. And part of that is based on people I met who worked at Murray's Cheese, which is a phenomenal place. I mean, it's a cheese wonderland in the Village of Manhattan. They also have a restaurant. But I did interview some of their staff, and people had worked there for years. The guy behind the counter had been there since he was a kid, and people, they fall in love with it. It's a true calling. And my character Leah, loved it as well. But once the winery is on the line, she realizes the cheese shop was always second prize to her. And when it comes down to it, she cannot continue to just give up on what she believed she was meant to do, which is work the soil on her family vineyard.
Right, but she does have, a certain amount of savvy, certain amount of muscle gained from running the cheese shop that applies to the winery.
Absolutely. And
It's
in fact,
not like she's stepping out of advertising or,
no.
printing or something to a winery. They are analogous businesses.
Absolutely. But from an emotional and mental standpoint, she says at one point her father never once asks her how her business is. He basically treats her like she runs a little trinket shop somewhere. She is never given the credit from the person whose opinion matters the most to her. So while she's a completely competent and accomplished businesswoman, she's coming into the winery situation with very little validation. And no matter how good you are, if you are not told you're good by people who matter, you may as well, be lacking in skill. That's how much it can actually affect you. And that's something she had to grapple with.
That, yes, that can be a very unempowering situation. And, part of what my least favorite new buzzword along with pivot is agency. But nonetheless, you are looking for, or the women here have got to decide whether they are going to gain agency or whether they're going to be supine and just let this thing happen to them. So we won't say how that part comes out, but let's talk about the Sexy Book Club. And why don't you recommend some books for people who would like to dive into this whole idea? Because we've had some response from readers already who said, we should start a Sexy Book Club. Give us some help.
Oh, I am more than happy to dive right in here. So I think my favorite sexy novel of all time is Mistral's Daughter by Judith Krantz, which is the story of 3 generations of women. It's set in France and New York City and spans World War II. And it's lush and it's dramatic, page turning, just the most perfect novel. So for anyone who's not familiar with these 80s books, I think that's a great place to start, because yes, there's a lot of sex in it, but there's a fabulous plot and wonderful women. It's a book that I reread every few years, even though it's like 1,000 pages or something. So anything with Judith Krantz, you can't go wrong. My favorite Jackie Collins book is Chances, which introduced her most famous heroine, Lucky Santangelo. And I write about Chances in Blush because she is the daughter of a very strong-handed businessman, a gangster, who is told this is not for you. And she pushes back and shows that she's as strong as any man in her father's orbit. There's a contemporary author one of the very few who's writing books sort of like this, and it's J.R. Ward, who's huge in paranormal, but she has a series called The Bourbon Kings, set on a Kentucky bourbon estate. And she kind of her stories sort of hit a lot of the notes of these 80s books in terms of their outrageous backstabbing and extreme characters and sex scenarios that make you blush. So that's my modern day recommendation.
That sounds great. Where do you put Jacqueline Suzanne in all this?
It's funny, for some reason, I didn't read a lot of Jacqueline Suzanne, and I don't know why. I didn't have access or exposure to her books in the same way I did the Judith Krantz, Jackie Collins, Shirley Conran. I'm not sure why. I'm not even sure if she was writing a little bit earlier. Maybe she was late 70s versus the 80s.
Maybe.
I think I just missed her.
Well, the only book of hers I ever read was the one about her dog, which was actually a very sweet book and not in the, the normal Jacqueline Suzanne mode. And I, for the life of me, can't once again recall the title. But yeah, I imagine that there were, you could go all the way back to something like Forever Amber, if you want to go into an historical bodice ripper. But there's a lot of story in Forever Amber. And it again applies to somebody who, despite all the things that happen to her, never really earns the love and respect of the one person that matters to her, even though eventually she saves his life with, some sort of, he's wounded and he has, I don't remember, an infection or something. And, she applies skills to save him and the whole bit. And her whole life is kind of devoted to making this guy, to earning his respect and his love, and she doesn't succeed. So even though it's an historical novel, there are very many similar themes. I'm also crazy about a book called Catherine by Anya Seton, which many people think is, along with me, is a really brilliant historical novel. And Catherine Swynford was a mistress who eventually married the Duke of Lancaster, and her children then are the ancestors of the Tudors. So she did pilot her way through extreme times and gain agency in the same way that Elizabeth, it'll come to me, the ancestress of the Dukes of Devonshire. She was actually an orphan who, over the course of 4 marriages, Elizabeth Shrewsbury, managed to become the second richest and most powerful woman in England. And the Chatsworth and all of they still live on the land and the money that she accumulated in the 16th century. So, I like historical novels that feature women who, in times when women were devalued, and assigned roles, gain agency. And so what you're talking about, is just modern versions of the same story.
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
What fun. So now that you've done Blush, what are you going to move on to?
I am continuing with my fascination with families, and I have a book coming out next summer set in a jewelry dynasty, sort of like a Tiffany's, a family jewelry company. They're synonymous with engagements and diamond rings. And of course, ironically, none of the children are lucky in love. And one of the sort of cast off grandchildren comes back to the fold to reclaim what's hers. So I had a lot of fun with that one, and we'll have that next summer.
So did you research that during the pandemic? Was it, did that necessarily limit what you were able to do? Or were you able to just head towards Tiffany's right over there next to Trump Tower, which I've always thought must have been a really hard 4 years for Tiffany.
Oh my goodness. It was that for sure. I mean, physically you were just blocked from going anywhere in Midtown. I mean, it was a logistical nightmare. But last year, I was really lucky. This was a book that didn't require me to be physically going to any place. I was in Provincetown, Massachusetts, all of last summer. And fortunately, there was a very robust estate sale culture on the Cape. And while I didn't go to a big iconic store like Tiffany, I did research in a much smaller way, in a much more intimate way. And I think actually might have ended up helping me in a way that being in a big Fifth Avenue store wouldn't have. So that's how I did my research last summer.
Tiffany's took on some women designers and so forth very early on. Paloma Picasso, excuse me, Paloma Picasso, I remember, began to design for Tiffany very modern designs at a long time back. So I've always thought they were very forward looking. And I think Tiffany's had a woman designer who, in fact, there's somebody's written a biography about it.
Is
Really
it Elsa
interesting.
Peretti?
Pardon me?
Elsa Peretti?
No, this is Louis Comfort Tiffany, the glass guy. And there was a woman who apparently did a lot of Tiffany's designs, but didn't get much credit for it. I don't remember the book, but I thought I like reading books about. There's a new one coming out about J.P. Morgan's librarian, Belle DaCosta Green, who was a noted bibliophile and, helped Morgan acquire and curate his collection in the Gilded Age and early 20th century. Women didn't do things like that. Even more interestingly, she's Black, but the story was that she was Portuguese and therefore, she was dark, but she was actually a Black woman navigating J.P. Morgan's Gilded Age society. And
Wow.
yeah, it's called The Personal Librarian by Marie Benedict and another author.
Oh, fantastic.
And I like it that people are looking back. I mean, there's a huge wave of books set during the Second World War about women's stories as opposed to military stories.
Yes.
But I like it that we're looking even further back and finding women who were who were able to break out of the expectations and confines of their time. The Blackwell Sisters, there's a new biography out about Elizabeth Blackwell and her sister, and she was the first woman to graduate from an accredited medical school, for example, and practice in America. And Sujata Masi has written 3 books about the first woman lawyer in India, in Bombay, India. She may have been the first actual accredited female lawyer. So, there's a lot of interest in people who are breaking molds, and whether contemporary or in the past, and what we owe them, what their heritage, what that means for us today.
Yes.
So I can see you had a lot of fun with this. Let's call Patrick up and see if there are any comments from the audience. Patrick? Come back. I love doing that. It's so powerful. I know. I'm going to get incense. I swear I'm going to get incense and light one, and then he'll come out and there'll be this big wave.
You have some very enthusiastic viewers and readers watching.
Great.
And they're getting really excited about the book, which is awesome.
Thank you.
Let's see. Debbie asks, will your next book center mainly on diamonds or other gems too?
Other gems too, and gold and silver, really all jewelry, and the way that we mark occasions with jewelry and how it's a reflection of us. So it's not just diamonds. I dive deep across the jewelry spectrum. And for anyone who's interested in nonfiction reading about jewelry, I love this book called Stoned by a woman named Aja Radin. It's a New York Times bestseller, and she goes way back in history and shows how sort of lust for stones, especially emeralds, kind of shaped history. It's fabulous.
There's a book by Matthew Hart called Diamond, which is hard to find, but very similar. He goes through, does a real deep dive into the diamond industry. And I've always loved it. It's kind of like Indiana Jones plus jewelry plus, travel. It's a great book.
Remember those, now I'm getting it too, Barbara. Gerald Brown, remember his thrillers?
I do.
It dealt with jewels.
Yep.
Yeah.
And, there's some great jewel heist books like Top Copy, if you want to, both the movie and the book and so forth. But, jewelry making, Fabergé is another example. It's almost impossible to resist the lure of Fabergé and the wonderful things that happen there and how collectible those things are. And there's a store, you'll know it in New York. It's I think it's on 59th. It's right near Central Park, but it's on the east side of Fifth Avenue, and it's a Russian jewelry store, and they had a fabulous Fabergé window display for years, or Fabergé in the store. Do you remember what it's called? Is it a la Russe or a la Vieille Russe or some such thing?
I
It's
don't
across from
know.
Bloomingdale's on the other
Okay.
side.
There's so many. I mean, it really is like the jewelry capital of, I mean, if that's your thing and you want to go exploring, it's almost impossible to hit every type and place of jewelry there. What I think is interesting, what's happening in jewelry today is, it used to be the first important piece of jewelry you might get were like pearls from your parents or your diamond engagement ring. And now, women are not, and men are not waiting to get jewelry from their significant other, but really becoming the primary buyer for themselves. And it's a huge shift from the post-World War II marketing and the way jewelry was sold to men as the buyer and women as the giftee. So I found that really interesting.
More questions, Patrick?
More questions, yeah. Let's see. Andrea asks about your research, presumably for Blush, but probably for this book too. Did you learn anything surprising or anything that maybe didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, so I mean, my learning curve was pretty steep for Blush. I didn't know a lot about wine going into it. I didn't know, for example, that even red wine, the grapes were originally green and they turn purple or red through a process called veraison. And so when you're at a vineyard, you can see the grapes like half green, slowly turning red. I didn't know that. And then there were just silly things, like they had the vines all like wrapped up in wire. And the vineyard manager told me that, wild turkeys will come and just gulp a grape plant whole, like a pelican, just consume it. And, the image of that I thought was so funny. It's a fascinating art as well as craft business. So I could, I didn't know anything. So everything was surprising to me.
If you go to a vineyard, you will notice that at the end of most rows, there's a rose bush. And the rose bushes are kind of a natural exterminator. They're there to attract bugs and so forth, to keep the vines clearer. And there's a terrific French TV series, if you belong to MHZ TV, which you can get through to an Amazon Fire Stick. It's called The Art of the Vine, and it's, I don't remember, 10 seasons or something, and it all is about wine. It's a wine expert who's the detective, and they take you through all these gorgeous French vineyards, chateau and the whole bit, but the plots generally revolve around the wine industry and the French dynastic. It actually reminds you of Blush, because you run into some of those same attitudes. But I mean, if you're just like a French landscape junkie, it's a great thing to watch, because you get to see all these cool, wonderful homes, chateau and the whole bit. But you can learn amazing amount about wine just watching it. So I really recommend it if you get interested in this whole subject.
And are you able to write off all your wine consumption when you were doing this?
Absolutely. And I told my body the calories don't count because it's research. So that went really well.
Yeah.
There's another question here. It's just a basic one. It says, what is Jamie currently reading?
Oh, okay. The last book I finished about a week ago was The Plot by, it's right here next to me, Jean Humph Horowitz.
I did a program with her a couple weeks ago.
Oh my goodness, I could not put this book down. And then I just bought yesterday a novel called With Teeth. I forget the author's name. It's a new novel. I think it's like a dark take on motherhood. So that I'm bringing that with me to Cape Cod this weekend.
So you're going to sit on the beach and read a dark take about motherhood? What does that say about you?
No, I'm going for work, so I'll be hunkered down in my hotel room reading a dark take on motherhood.
Okay, there you go.
It's just one of those books, that came recommended from people I really trust. And, once I get that type of consensus, I have to get the book. I don't ask questions. I don't even dive too deep into the synopsis. I pick it up.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you liked the plot. It was our May crime book of the month. I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
It really was. And, the way she kind of went inside baseball and publishing was just something I hadn't seen before, at least not the way she did it. Maybe Stephen King had a few times here and there throughout his books, but I just loved it. And I'd read her before, but to me, this was a standout.
Well, hilariously, when talking about it, she didn't write it as a crime novel. She's not a crime novelist, and so the way it's turned out and the way it's been presented was something of a surprise to her. She was really a lot of fun to talk to, but I think it's a great. There's also one called "Who is Maud Dixon?" Or is that the title, Patrick? Who is Maud?
That's
Dixon?
right.
Yes.
And it's not the same, but there are some similarities in them. And I thought that was a very well done book it's surprised. You thought you knew how it was going to turn out, and then it was surprising. So I thought this has been a wonderful year for books.
Yeah.
I mean, it really has been just an amazing number of truly, don't you think, Patrick?
It's been incredible. Yeah, it really has.
It's a lucky thing that books don't age on the shelf. They're not like cheese, I mean, we're really fortunate that you can stock up because, next year could be a really bad vintage for books. But right now it is so good. So, buy now and lay down your cellar and be prepared, for any coming drought. Would be a good thing.
I love that. That's really good advice.
I do have a
Stock up.
question. I have a question here from Joni. And we actually get this question a lot for writers. It says, with all the research you do for your books, how do you not fall down the rabbit hole? When do you know when to stop with the research and focus on writing the novel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have a very tight schedule. I publish a book a year. So I know the longer I take to get started, I know it's just going to be that much more painful for me at the end of the year. So as much as I love research, I'm very eager to have enough absorbed that I can start writing, because that's when I can kind of take a deep breath and know I'm going to make my deadline and have the book for the following summer. So it's just part of my job to know when enough is enough. And you can always go back and add, and that's something, perfectionism is not a writer's friend. So you don't have to know everything starting out. And sometimes you don't know what you're going to need to round out the story. So you can't possibly do all the research up front.
So if this is your sixth novel, is that correct?
Yes.
I didn't ask you a basic question, Bad Me, which is, how did you come to writing? Because you must have done other things before.
Yeah. Well, I always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't think I could. It just seemed like one of those magical things that was not realistic. No one ever told me. I had a teacher when I was in fourth grade, and I told her I wanted to be a writer, and she said, well, maybe you can be a teacher. No one was telling me go for it, except for Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz. So I did the next best thing. I started working in book publishing right after college. And I spent many years in various jobs in and around books. And seeing that it's not magic, that it takes just, work and focus and the help of a good agent, a good editor, a good publicist, that there's a whole team behind you, that writers hand in bad books and they get fixed, and that writers are late on deadline and the world doesn't fall apart. It gave me the confidence to at least try. But I really had to see behind the curtain, so to speak, before I could allow myself to give it a shot.
So now you're a full-time writer. You must be if you're writing a book a year, because you wouldn't have time for anything else.
Yeah, I am. It is full-time. And it's full-time and then some.
Got it.
Somebody was asking about, can you repeat the info about the book Stoned? And that's
Sure.
by Aja Radin or Aja,
That's
right?
right. The author's last name, her first name is AJA, and her last name is RADEN. And there is a long subtitle, but I
Yeah.
can't remember it. It's like
It's
How Desire Shaped the World or something like that.
Jewelry, Obsession, and
Yeah.
How Desire Shapes the World.
That's it.
I will put in a link to our website if they'd like to buy one.
Yeah.
There's also a really brilliant book that the Smithsonian put out, Patrick, which I pushed very much for Mother's Day. If you can find it, you should put the link in too. It's about gems in the Smithsonian collection, which has some really famous ones, but whoever wrote it went way back into the history of the stone, the history of the donor, fashion. I mean, it's just, and the color plates, the book is just gorgeous. I don't know where they had it printed, but the front cover shimmers and the very thick paper, and it's gorgeous inside. I know it's like, it's some boring title like the Smithsonian. I could probably look it up while you talk. I'll look it up. You talk to her for a minute. I'll look it up.
I've got Book Manager open. I'll do it.
Okay.
Smithsonian.
Yeah, and it's a quality paperback, so it's not outrageously expensive, but it's so well made. It has thick cardboard.
Got it.
Very, what's it called?
Unearthed. The Smithsonian National Gem, something or other.
Right, Unearthed. And
Unearthed.
honestly, it is really fabulous. We bought loads of it, and I really encouraged it as a Mother's Day gift because, there are just so many winners in it. But
Oh yeah.
I love the way the jewelry and the clothes of the women. Marjorie Merriweather Post has a big section in it, because she was such an important donor. And you'll love this. And we'll close with this. Years and years ago, when I was the senior at Stanford, I became engaged to the son of a diplomat. It didn't work out super well as a marriage, but that's another question. But in any case, I was invited to spend New Year's in Washington, D.C. with his family. And we were invited to a very elegant New Year's Eve party, which in fact was at some embassy. And I was, awkward and kind of embarrassed, and I didn't know any of these people. So there I was. And at one point I sat down next to this woman who was kind of elderly and was wearing black, and she was like paved in stones. And to me, they looked just like rhinestones. They weren't all that clean. They didn't really sparkle and all. And I thought, well, I don't feel so bad because here's this woman in rhinestones at this party. And then as I was leaving, somebody said, did you see Marjorie Merriweather Post? She brought out all her diamonds for this occasion. And I thought, oh my God, I sat down next to her, without having any idea who she was. And, and she was, I swear to you, she was almost paved in diamonds.
Wow, that's amazing.
On her shoes, everywhere. And my experience was not with real diamonds. It was, shoes with rhinestones and all the rest of it. So that's kind of what I thought she was. So it was a real surprise. But she turns out to be a very heavy donor to the Smithsonian. And there's some other wonderful stories of women who, or even men, who contributed to it. So it's a great book. I hope you'll enjoy it. Unearthed. Right. So Jamie, this has been great. Patrick, am I leaving anybody out?
No, I don't think so. People seem to be interested in these books, so that's great.
That is great.
Yeah.
It's really been a pleasure to meet. Excuse me, a pleasure to meet you. I
Thank
hope
you
we get
so
to
much
do
for
this
listening.
again when you come out with. We'll have a lot of fun with the jewelry book.
I think we're going to have a lot. I can see already. We're going to need 2 hours for the jewelry
We might,
conversation.
or you maybe even could come and see us live, and then we'll see what we can do.
I would love that.
It
Thank
would
you
be-
so much, everyone. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you all for joining us. Don't forget, we still have autographed copies of Blush, kindly signed by Jamie for the Poison Pen. And you can still, wonderful signature. So you can still order some. As Patrick said, he put the link in our website, or you can just go to poisonpen.com and type it in the web store. There'll be a podcast available tomorrow of this conversation, and the video is going to live forever on our Facebook page. So if you know people who missed this conversation, do point out the podcast and the video to them, because just they won't age, just like the books we mentioned. They will stay fresh. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Goodbye, Jamie.
Bye.
Bye, Patrick.
Hi.